Good afternoon. It is 12 o'clock and welcome to the 10-day Handshake Challenge. We are spending just a few minutes together today to kick off our career future with some simple steps. And we've been doing this over the last few days, and today is day 9. So I really appreciate you being here. Each day we go through a specific action item as well as a value-added item to dig in a little bit deeper into the topic. So for today, our action item is to ask a question out in Handshake land. So going out into your Handshake profile, you can click on the Q&A within the toolbar, and you can ask really any question out into to your peers, to employers that are out there who are responding, and get specific responses. So the responses that you get are oftentimes based upon the question you ask. And so a big piece of what we're talking about today is really what is in a good question. How do you ask a good question? I'd like to first say that really any question is a good question because curiosity is such an important element of your job search, of being a pharmacy student. Asking questions in curiosity and that inquiry is so important. So any question is a good question, but I'm going to dig through a few pointers on what you might consider when you're framing a question and how to go about asking that. So there's so many knowledgeable folks on Handshake that really these questions will be answered either by, again, peers, alumni, potentially employers. So how do we ask questions to get information that will help us make decisions about our career? Really, that's for the most part where pharmacy students are at. They're asking questions to gain knowledge about pharmacy practice, about career options, and really, ultimately, when you're looking at it from a career perspective, it's about how you specifically are going to make decisions, because there are so many different options for pharmacists, and people are going to share their experiences with you. Just because their experience is not always necessarily going to be the right match for you. So asking questions and then discerning and really synthesizing that information from multiple sources, multiple individuals will help you make decisions. So what goes into a good question? One of those pieces is to share why you are asking the question. So really to explain what your interest is and what your knowledge is about the question that you're asking. So to share a little bit more information of how you came to know that you had a question, right? So sharing why you're interested, showing that genuine interest, that is part of asking a good question. Being specific is part of asking a good question versus being very general and broad. Knowing your audience and how to frame your question based upon your audience makes a good question. And then also just how to format that question. So starting with what, how, or when are good prompts of how to know if you're asking a good question. Typically, if you're asking a question that begins with why, sometimes people can get into a defensive stance. So, or assume that maybe there's some judgment behind your question. When you ask questions such as, why did you decide to choose pharmacy school? Now, a lot goes into this, like for you as an individual, if you were to be asked this question, why did you decide to choose pharmacy school? As an example, it's about your relationship with that individual. It's about your understanding of their intent. But typically when questions begin with why, we are feeling like there's maybe a judgment behind the question, or it puts people a little bit on the defensive. So some examples here in the green of how you could reframe a question the exact same question, but just not starting with why, is to say, what experiences have led you to choose pharmacy school? Or how did you come to know that pharmacy school was right for you? So it's the same question, but you're beginning with what, how, or when. So that is one tip of how to ask a good question. That knowing your audience. Here are some examples. So in the red, the question, how can I prepare for this program? So let's consider, you're choosing a pharmacy school, or in 3, 4 years, depending where you're at in pharmacy school, you are maybe preparing for a residency or a fellowship. If you're asking this general question to an audience, let's say a residency program director and a resident, so 2 different audiences, they have 2 different roles. When you ask the question, how can I prepare for this program? It doesn't meet your audience where they're at, because they're going to answer this just really generally. But instead, if you ask a question that's really directed towards your audience, so the first one in the green, what strength do you use most frequently and which has served you well in this program? That would be much more directed towards a resident, because you're asking about, preparation that they've used within the program. So it's talking about where they're specifically at. The second example in green, what attributes or skills do you value the most, and which skills do preceptors value the most? Now this is directed toward the audience of a residency program director, because it's about where their motivation is at, what they value in a candidate. So you are altering this more general question of how can I prepare for this program to meet your audience. Asking those specific questions. So an example of what might be a little bit too general or too broad: what student organizations are available to join? Now this question is really broad. If I were to ask that question, they might simply just tell me the facts of the 16 different pharmacy student organizations that are available. Now, this is the exact same information that I might be able to find out on the website or on, a resource. But if I were to dig in a little bit deeper and ask something more specific, now I'm going to get deeper information. So how could I make this question more specific? In the green, what helped you make a decision about which student organization and activities to join? So directed towards an audience for that one of a student, and it's very specific about their decision-making process. How did you make a decision about the student organizations? Maybe it's about resources. Well, which resources did you find most helpful in making that decision? So you're wanting to be very specific with your questions. And to show that genuine interest, or to share the reasons why you're asking that question, is to give a little bit more detail, right? So what activities are available in pharmacy school? So that's not a really good question, because it doesn't share anything about why you're asking that question. It doesn't share anything about why you're interested in that. So maybe giving just a little bit more detail. I'm interested in cost measures of how pharmacists can care for their patients while helping make the cost effective for them. Which organizations or activities should I consider participating in as a student pharmacist with this interest in mind? So you're just giving a little bit more information about you, about your interest, and why you're asking the question. And now you're going to get much deeper, much richer information that's going to help you ultimately, throughout pharmacy school, gain more knowledge, gain more resources, and ultimately help you make better career decisions. With just those specific questions, knowing your audience, knowing the reasons, kind of why you're asking, sharing that interest, and being able to reframe questions that start not with why, but how, what, or when. So I appreciate you being on today. We are at our time. I'm happy to take any questions that you have about reaching out on your Handshake profile to ask a question in that Q&A as your action item, or any of this value-added tips that I've shared. Feel free to type in the chat.